What's up, everybody? So I've been wanting to make a video about the European Switch 2 sales for a while now, and the intention was to make something either today or tomorrow, and conveniently we got kind of an information dump today. So I figured instead of confusing everybody and having one overarching video talking about the Switch 2 sales in Europe, I'll break it down into a few different videos so we can properly analyze the sales patterns, how well the console launched, how poorly it sold after that console's launch, and more specifically, just how terrible the holiday season was for the Switch 2 in all of these countries. And Europe is very important to discuss because I think it's the last chunk of data where there's still potentially misinformation being spread about how well it's doing, because it's not doing well over there, and that's been known for a few months now. It just took a while for it to be clear to some people. Like right now, it's very obvious that the Switch 2 in Japan is still very much in demand, and the only reason it's currently at the sales number that it's at is because they haven't sent more units. So I can tell you without a doubt that if they ship another 4 million units to Japan from now until March 31st, they will sell exactly 4 million units, and if they send more than that, they will likely sell those as well. It's a big reason why I think Nintendo can still potentially reach its 19 million sales forecast despite the poor holidays. But I'll get to that in a later video. In contrast to that, we have the States, something that people have been assuming was selling very well for months now, largely saying that they're waiting for the holidays for the big bump, and I was always arguing that the patterns indicated that the holidays were going to be poor, and now we sit here without a doubt knowing that the Switch 2 failed this holiday season, and actually I would consider it a failure for its first year given the stock that was available. Now in this article that's shared by videogamechronicles.com that's kind of been making its way around the internet, the headline states that the Switch 2 sales slowed down over Christmas, and they're down 35% in the US compared to Switch 1's launch. It should be made very clear, and I thought it was kind of obvious when this article first dropped, they actually don't have data about the Switch sales in America for December yet. And even if it wasn't obvious, Matt Piscatella of Circana eventually did share a conversation saying, hey, just so you guys know, if they have December information, it's not from us. Now, personally, I think the 35% is an assumption made based off of the November numbers. And I realize I'm talking about US numbers right now, but I think it's important to address this very quickly before I jump into France. If you recall, the data that was shared to us from Circana for the month of November was that the Switch 1 and the Switch 2 together had sold 10% fewer units than what was sold last year from the Switch 1 alone during the month of November in the US. Using the Circana November data from last year, the assumption is that they sold around 610,000. That would be of November 2024. So a year after that, the assumption is that the Switch 1 plus the Switch 2 together sold 550,000, or rather fewer than 550,000. So I think they're making a conservative estimate and saying that the Switch 2 sold 500,000, whereas the Switch 1 sold 50,000, because there's no way it was any more than 500,000. Personally, I think the Switch 2 was realistically closer to 450,000, but that's fine. I'm assuming they're expecting that it sold 500,000. So if you do the math, the Switch 1 in 2017 sold 775,000 units in November, minus the 500,000 maximum number that they're guessing for November of this year. That would give you a difference of 275,000 units. And if you take 275,000, you divide it by 775,000, that's a 35% drop. So I'm thinking this article is basically assuming that that 35% is going to hold until the end of the year, and that's why they're saying that the holidays saw a 35% drop for US sales. Which is funny because by their estimates, that would imply that the Switch 2 sold 1 million units in December. And I don't know, I personally don't see that. I was tracking Target, Walmart, and Amazon. I could be way off, but I'm guessing it's around 650,000. It is a bit harder to predict these sales and track them during the holiday seasons because the numbers are a lot higher. So there's a cap on how many units can be tracked, and I can go into this further in a later video as well. But whatever the case is, obviously I could be wrong because I don't have insider information, but I don't anticipate that the Switch 2 is going to hit 1 million in December. And I think the people at this article just went with that 35% drop off because that's like a minimum. It might be more than that. I doubt it's going to be less than that though. But yeah, that's the information for the States. Chris Dring, the person that is giving the information here on the article, he's like the Matt Piscatella of the UK. Normally, whenever data comes in about how well the Switch 2 is doing over there, we get it from him. He has some interesting takes. Most of them are very pro-Sony, anti-Nintendo, so a lot of Nintendo fans will shrug him off as if he's not reliable. But the data that he shares, I think that's undoubtedly reliable. Or at the very least, the data he shares about the UK. And I'm saying this because you're going to see a lot of people try to shrug off this information he's sharing as if he's like spreading just incorrect stuff. He's not. He's being factual here. The only thing is he's taking some liberties about his estimates about the US numbers, which I understand the criticism for that, but being wrong about the US numbers or, jumping the gun about the US numbers does not mean that he's wrong about what's going on in the UK. Anyway, as you read through the article, you get to a paragraph here that talks about the France numbers. According to TGB, which I believe is the game business, the 2025 Switch 2 sales were over 30% lower than that of the Switch 1 in its first year. So basically, in all of 2025, from June until the end of the holiday period, there were fewer Switch 2 units sold in comparison to the amount of Switch 1s that were sold in 2017 from March until the holiday period, or until the end of the year rather. So obviously, launches aligned, this still implies that the Switch 2 is doing better than the Switch 1. This is kind of the final beacon of hope for most Nintendo fans right now. They're still grasping onto the fact that the Switch 2 launches align is ahead of the Switch 1, but basically all signs indicate that the sell-through units are going to be significantly more for the Switch 1 in 3 months' time when the Switch 1 pretty much doubled its numbers. The Switch 1 historically had a very slow start, and it bounced up massively in the holidays. That's why many people thought the same thing would happen with the Switch 2. Obviously, it did not happen, which means that in 3 months' time, the Switch 1 is easily going to be ahead of the Switch 2 in pretty much every market, except for maybe Japan. This is also with the idea that the Switch 2 has been readily available since pretty much its second month. This is also with the idea of just how many units they had available at launch. All of these advantages that the Switch 2 had, even if it's 6 months window, it had more provided to it and a better chance to achieve more than the Switch 1 did in 2017, but it failed to meet that expectation in France by being more than 30% lower. And I'm going to break that down to you guys into absurd detail that you probably don't need, but you can have fun with. So first, let's put things into perspective. When the Switch 2 launched in France, the information was shared here by Oscar Lemaire. I think I said that right. But on June 10th, he posted on Blue Sky that the Switch 2 had sold 169,000 units. This broke the record by the PS5 by quite a bit, which was at 107,000 units. He shared a graph too, and it looks like the Switch 1 initially when it launched was around 105,000 units. So that means that when the Switch 2 launched, it sat 65,000 units ahead of the Switch 1, which gave it a 40% lead. And now at the end of the year, it's at a 30% deficit. So you're looking at a 70% swing. This is huge. Because you have to remember, this isn't equal launches. This is one of them starting with a massive head start, way more units than the other one does. And then the sales numbers completely dissipating to the point that not only did they get back to being 0-0, which is like would make them tied, it dropped an additional 30%. That is like embarrassingly bad. That's a failure. Now, keep in mind, based off the trajectory of what we've seen around other places in the world, going into the holiday season, for the most part, almost everywhere, the Switch 2 was still outselling the Switch 1. Remember, the Switch 1 doubled its amount of units that were sold during the holidays. So while some people might be like, well, launch is aligned, it's still got 3 more months, obviously the Switch 2 isn't going to sell as much as the Switch 1. Pretty much worldwide, in every place, everywhere, going into November, the Switch 2 had a lead over the Switch 1. This is the clear assumption, and this is a large reason why back in October, not that many people understood just how bad it was going to get for the Switch 2, because in their minds, they're like, well, it's still leading, so who cares? So this is why the holiday numbers are very important to focus on, and even if it's 3 months shorter than the Switch 1, it still makes a very big difference. And again, the Switch 1 in pretty much all of these locations, at least for the first 3 months of its life, which would take it up to the launch of the Switch 2, had massive stock issues, and in most cases, those stock issues carried on well beyond June. And these are not assumptions on my end. You can jump online and search whatever you want. I've made videos about this. I'm not going into it again. Jump on Google, search a specific window of time in like 2017 from March to October, and you can see pretty much in every single country, some forum, some article, something popping up about the Switch 1 having stock issues potentially up to October. So again, this idea that 6 months versus 9 months makes that big of a difference is actually completely wrong. That doesn't matter. Going into the holidays, the Switch 2 has a lead. Walking out of the holidays, the Switch 1 is well ahead of the Switch 2. That should be the focus of everything. Now, dating back to January 11th of 2018, there was an article by thegameindustry.biz stating that the Nintendo Switch 1 is officially the fastest selling game console in France with 911,000 consoles sold during 2017. So using that data and the assumption that the Switch 2 is over 30% lower than the 911,000, that means that the maximum amount of Switch 2 units that have been sold this year would be 637,000. So this same article would also imply that the Switch 2 has sold less than the Wii, which sold 703,000 in its first year, as well as the PlayStation 4, which sold 650,000 in its first year. And I'm sure if I dig around, I can find another console or two that are probably above the Switch 2 as well, but I think this kind of makes the point already. And again, just as a quick reminder, that's the Nintendo Wii, the Switch, and the PlayStation 4, which all had stock issues. But all 3 of those ones, at least, still outsold the Switch 2. And I think let's dig a little bit deeper into that. We said that the Switch 1 managed to sell 911,000 total, and when it launched, it sold 105,000. So if you remove the launch weekend for the Switch 1, through all of these months of low stock availability and a massive boom in the holidays, this bad boy managed to sell 806,000 consoles, with a very significant portion of that coming later on in the year as they got most stock available and as momentum continued to build, and as they got to the holidays and the Switch 1 just started booming and never looked back. In contrast, for the Switch 2, we said it sold 637.7 thousand maximum. I'm going to round that down to 635, so it's a fairly even number. If we do the same thing now, and we minus that massive launch weekend that it had in France, that record-breaking, fastest-selling console in the world, fastest-selling console, that number of 169,000, all that remains throughout the year, including the holidays, is only 466,000. So 806,000 outside of the launch window for the Switch 1 was sold throughout that entire year, and 466,000 sold outside of the launch weekend for the Switch 2. That is a 42% drop-off when you get rid of the launch weekend. This is very important for people to grasp onto because we talked about this when the console launched. I talked about this when the console launched. I don't know if anybody else that has a voice online was saying the same thing I was, but I highlighted very clearly that when the console launches with such a high stock availability, eventually the lines will converge. And within less than the first year, just by the end of the first holiday season, the lines not only converged, they surpassed it completely, where the Switch 1 is in a 30% lead in France, with the Switch 2 being behind it. It's basic math, it's basic understanding of the laws of supply and demand, and it's logical because we've seen time and time again how little those opening launch weekends matter. And no matter how much I talked about it, no matter how much I tried to make it clear for people, there are still hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people around the world that have their hands on the side of their head with their mouth wide open, shocked and appalled that the Switch 2 could actually be behind the Switch 1 in France on its first year. That was never the assumption of anybody in a billion years. In fact, when the console launched and it was 40% ahead of the Switch 1, most people assumed that with the stock that's going to be available for the Switch 2, and with all of these fun ideas about the potential new games that might be announced, which never got announced, that it would probably be a safe bet to assume that by the end of the first year, the console would be twice as ahead of the Switch 1 was in 2017. Instead, and we're talking about France specifically, it's behind 30%. More than 30%. 30% is like the maximum that it's behind. 911,000 sold for France in the first year, 635,000 maximum for the Switch 2 in its first year. With stock issues for the Switch 1, coming off of the Wii U for the Switch 1, which meant that they had to convince people that it was worth jumping back into Nintendo after the Wii U, whereas the Switch 2 was a shoo-in for success, didn't have to convince anybody of anything. All they had to do was launch the console, not grossly increase the prices of everything across the board, and provide an actual good game that would be appealing to people. And I would argue they needed something interesting to appeal to people to buy this console instead of just making the next number up. Calling it a 2 and just making it a stronger Switch 1 makes it much less appealing for the masses. They offered no innovation, whereas the Switch 1 did. And that's a very big reason why it's not catching up to it. And you can see it at the very end of this GameIndustry.biz article from back in 2017. The publication asked Philippe Leveau, I think I said that right, who works for Nintendo of Europe, used to be the CEO of Nintendo France actually. They asked him about Nintendo's investment in 4K, and he stated that Nintendo needs to look at what it can do differently from its competitors, because if Nintendo does the same thing as Microsoft and Sony, then it is doomed to die. Damn, that is a good quote. And such a good indication of why the Switch 2 just had a worse 2025 than the Switch 1 did in 2017. I'm telling you, like, a lot of the stuff that's been coming up in the conversations over the past few months, you can find it by just going through the internet. Like, the internet has all this information for us. It's not hard to find these things. You can see the vibe of how people felt and what they were talking about if you just look around. Doomed to die, said the CEO of Nintendo France in 2017. I guess technically when this quote came out, it was like the 11th day of 2018, but you get the point. And now we sit here in January of 2026, 8 years later, with a new Nintendo console that literally did exactly the same thing that Microsoft and Sony do. They made it bigger, they made it stronger, they focused on 4K, they did nothing innovative, and it's no wonder that the Switch 2 is showing signs that it's clearly doomed to die. And since we're talking about digital footprints of some of this stuff, when Oscar Lemaire shared his tweet saying that 169,000 Switch 2s were sold in France on launch weekend, look at some of these translated tweets. This one over here. While everywhere you hear that it's too expensive, the game's too, that the starting lineup is empty, and everything is Nintendo's commercial policy is a smokescreen. Basically implying that all of these complaints were nothing. It was just people complaining for no reason, and it wouldn't amount to anything. Keep in mind, this is using Google Translate, so it sounds funny when you translate it sometimes. Here's another one. So the hordes of trolls and angry people who've been relentlessly bashing it for the past week all over the internet and social media haven't stopped them from buying it, just as expected. Oh no, my friend. We, trolls and angry people that spent all of that time relentlessly bashing it for the past week all over the internet, and some of us went for way longer than a week, we indeed did not buy it. And that's why we are where we are right now. Here's another fun one. I was hoping the price of the games would make people back off or at least postpone their purchases so that Nintendo would make a goodwill gesture, LOL. There was very little chance of that. Don't worry, you actually were right to hope that, because that's exactly what's happening. And look, dude, these are just like the replies of a single tweet of data about one country in Europe. But we've all been seeing this same type of arrogance and ignorance all throughout the past year. And specifically France, I love talking about this one because France was the first country, the first place where the Switch 2 started to get price drops, where the discounts all started to drop. And those of us that have knowledge on supply and demand decided to talk about how this is a clear indication that sales were very much slowing down, and now you can't even argue it. But we were laughed at, we were called doomers, we were scoffed at, and we were told that we were idiots for not realizing that Leclerc was clearly just being a loss leader, you morons. If you want a laugh, go to my comment section for that video and just scroll through them. Look at the bottom ones, not the ones that are at the top, because those ones get the likes and the positive hearts from me. Go to the ones from the willfully ignorant and the confidently incorrect individuals that just do not understand simple concepts of supply and demand because they are way too blinded by their love for nostalgia for a fake plumber. And I say that as somebody that has more love and more nostalgia for this plumber than anybody else, and I have, I think, over 20 hours of 3D Mario retrospectives to prove that. With the most recent one uploaded just a few days ago, by the way, a 2-hour-long video on Super Mario 3D Land. Who the hell makes a Super Mario 3D Land video that's 2 hours long if they're not a massive Nintendo fan and understand this company more than anybody else out there that's willing to put their reputation and their image on the line? Because I am clearly a bigger fanboy than all of these people that did not understand what the Switch 2 was doing wrong going into this launch. Check out my video over on Nintendine Plus if you're interested. I told everybody back when they dropped the prices in France that I dug through the internet and I searched in those same time windows through all of 2017 to see if at any point in time the Switch 1 received discounts after it launched, and sure enough, there was no indication of the Switch 1 having any discounts in Europe after it launched in the same way that the Switch 2 did. The best thing you can find when one of these stores was trying to be a loss leader was like maybe offering a gift card in addition to your purchase of the Switch 1. But to have a straight up discount to the point where a price war emerged, the other stores started dropping the price, they started competing with one another, something that has not happened. And again, same thing, I searched for the PS5. This didn't happen with any of those consoles, and those consoles have now outsold the Switch 2 in their first year. So they had more units sold, and they did not need to drop the price because people wanted those consoles. They'd walk in and buy them. That's it. You don't need to drop the price for something that's in demand. The Switch 2 is a console that, at least for France for now, I'll get into further detail about this as I cover the other countries in the coming days, but at least in France, I can say this without a doubt, and nobody can question me about this anymore. The Switch 2 is currently failing in France. If there is not a quick turnaround, this is failing. I'm not gonna say it failed yet, but it's failing. And the only time that it was ever good in France was in that opening month. Since then, it's been failing. There is no more debate about this. It had a bad launch year. It was not the fastest selling console in the largest and most popular market in Europe for Nintendo. And as we break things down further, it's not going to be the fastest selling console in pretty much the entire world by the time I'm done going through all of these, except for maybe Japan. It might take a little bit longer for us to get to that point in discussion though. And look, Over here in the States, we've seen like, what, $50 discounts for the Switch 2? Micro Center still has the base Switch for 400 bucks, and I'm pretty sure all you have to do is make a free account to get that deal. In France, the price drops have been a lot more aggressive. So all of this is happening, and in France, the discounts started much earlier. Most of you that listen to my videos, you're based out of the States. The discounts didn't start till Cyber Monday. In France, they started, I don't remember exactly, it was either late September or early October. And as time went on, the prices continued to drop down more and more. So right now, we are very clearly seeing that even with the Switch 2 having discounts, it is still struggling and it is failing. The expectations that it had and where it currently sits is a very clear indication that the hype and the sales numbers are dwindling away. And if only there were any idiots out there that would have talked about this clearly, in depth, and broken it all down for the past 8 months. It would have been so nice for somebody to know what was going on. Thank you guys for listening. Next time, I will discuss the sales in the United Kingdom.